On October 11th, 1975, at approximately 11:30 in the evening, George Carlin walked out onto a stage at 30 Rockefeller Plaza in New York City and said the first words in the history of Saturday Night Live. The show had never aired before. Nobody in the audience knew whether it was going to work. The cast was unknown. The format was unlike anything on American television at the time. Live, improvised at the edges, built on a comic sensibility that was more aligned with the counterculture underground than with the variety shows it was nominally replacing. The network had approved it cautiously. The producer who had conceived it was 29 years old and had not yet proven that what he imagined could exist as a broadcast program. Lorne Michaels had chosen George Carlin to open the show. This was not an obvious choice in the way that some choices appear obvious in retrospect. Carlin was well known by 1975, had built a serious following through his albums and through appearances on television talk shows, and had completed what was by then understood as a significant transformation of his artistic identity, from the clean-cut, suit-wearing television comedian of the 1960s to the long-haired, denim-wearing counterculture voice who had found his true audience in the early 1970s. He was the right person in the right moment for the right kind of show. But Carlin had agreed to host with something that he had not fully shared with Michaels or with the production team. Something that would shape how he approached the evening, and that would become visible in ways that were difficult to anticipate. He was not certain he belonged in the format. This was not a matter of confidence. Carlin had spent more than 15 years developing the specific performance style that had made him one of the most distinctive voices in American comedy. The carefully constructed observation, the language-based premise, the material that rewarded close attention rather than demanding immediate response. He had built this style in clubs and concert halls and recording studios, in the specific conditions that suited it. Saturday Night Live was something else. It was television, live television, with its particular set of constraints and its particular relationship with an audience that was not in the room. And what Carlin had spent the previous several years building was, in certain important ways, precisely suited to the room. He had said yes. He had come to New York. He had met the cast and the writers and the producer, and he had kept to himself the thing he was actually thinking. The cameras were going to roll. He was going to walk out and say the first words in the history of this show. What those words were going to be, and what was going to happen after them, was not entirely settled in his mind when he arrived at 30 Rock. What nobody watching the broadcast that night would have been able to guess was how much of what happened had not been planned. What Carlin brought to the broadcast that night was not the material the show's producers had expected. He had 3 stand-up segments scheduled throughout the evening. The first, hosting structures Saturday Night Live would ever use, a format that put the host in a specific performer's role rather than the MC's role that variety shows had established. Between the sketches and the musical performance, Carlin would come out and do stand-up. It was, in theory, the thing he did best, in the format that suited him most. But what Carlin did in those segments was not the sharply constructed, language-focused material that had built his audience in the early 1970s. What he brought to the broadcast, to the live studio, to the cameras, to the Saturday Night Live audience watching across the country, was something different, something that was more political, more directly confrontational with the moment, more concerned with the immediate landscape of 1975 America than with the timeless observation that had characterized his best album work. He talked about drugs. He talked about the state of the country. He talked about football and baseball in a bit that was, in compressed television form, a version of material he had performed at much greater length in his concert work. The audience responded. The material was good. It was always good. Because the underlying intelligence was always there. Because the observation was always precise. But it was not, for those who knew his work most closely, the thing he was most capable of. Something was slightly off. Not in any way that was visible to a casual viewer. The broadcast was, by any external standard, a success. The show worked. The cast was extraordinary. The format announced itself with genuine force as something new in American television. But in the specific context of what Carlin had been building, what those who had followed his work most carefully had come to expect, the 3 stand-up segments felt like a compromise. Not a dishonest one, not a cynical one, but a compromise with the format, with the requirements of live television, with the time constraints, with the particular audience relationship that broadcast demanded. Carlin had felt this during the broadcast. People who were with him that evening said afterward that he had been visibly uncertain between segments, not about his performance, which was what it was, but about the fundamental question of whether what he was doing was the right use of the material he had. Television, even live and free-form television, asked something from a performer that the concert stage did not. It asked for a version of the work that could be received without the full context of the relationship between performer and audience that the room provides. And Carlin's work, by 1975, was built for the room. The broadcast ended. Saturday Night Live had made its entrance into American culture. The cast was going to become famous. The show was going to run for decades. Carlin was not going to come back as host. And the reason was not what most people assumed it was. To understand why Lorne Michaels chose Carlin, it helps to understand what Michaels was trying to build and what he believed a host was for. Saturday Night Live had been conceived as a deliberate departure from the television comedy that preceded it. The variety show format that had defined American television comedy for 2 decades, the careful scripting, the celebrity guests, the theatrical pacing, the smooth surfaces that concealed the labor of production, was precisely what Michaels was not interested in making. He wanted something rawer, more alive to the possibility of failure, more willing to put the seams of production on display rather than hiding them. The cast he had assembled, young, unknown, unproven on a national platform, embodied this approach. They were not polished. They were not safe. They were performing at the edge of what their material could do, without the cushion of experience to fall back on if something didn't work. The host, in this context, was not a traditional variety show MC. The host was the figure who could give the audience a stable reference point, someone whose credibility was established, whose sensibility aligned with the show's, who could make the unknown cast feel like they belonged in the same room as someone the audience already trusted. Carlin was that person. He had earned, through the transformation of his public artistic identity in the early 1970s, a specific kind of credibility with exactly the audience Michaels was trying to reach. The albums Class Clown, Occupation Fool, FM, and AM had built a relationship with an audience that was young, culturally engaged, resistant to the safe forms, and hungry for comedy that treated them as intelligent. They were the audience that Saturday Night Live was designed for. Michaels called Carlin. Carlin said yes. But what Carlin said yes to was an appearance in a format he had spent the previous several years consciously moving away from. Television had been part of his early career, the Tonight Show appearances, the guest slots on the variety shows, And what he had found in those appearances was that the format required adjustments to the material that he was no longer willing to make. Television wanted the clean version, the shorter version, the version with the edges removed. His audience wanted the opposite. He had resolved this tension by moving away from television toward albums and concert performances, where the material could be what it actually was, without the adjustments the broadcast format required. And now he had agreed to return to television on the biggest possible night. The night a new show broadcast for the first time in a live format where the adjustments would have to happen in real time in front of an audience with no ability to stop and recut. He had brought something with him to New York that was not quite the material the show's format had anticipated, and what happened when the cameras rolled would reveal the specific shape of the space between what Saturday Night Live had been designed to hold and what George Carlin had come to give it. The broadcast began, and for the first section of the evening it went more or less as planned. But the night was not built for smoothness, and neither, by 1975, was Carlin. The reason Carlin was not invited back to host Saturday Night Live was not animosity. It was not failure. It was not a decision made in anger or disappointment on either side. It was a recognition arrived at gradually by both Carlin and by the show's producers that the fit between what Carlin did and what Saturday Night Live needed from a host was not the fit that anyone had assumed it would be. The show needed hosts who could serve the ensemble, who could move fluidly between the sketches and the monologue, between the performer's role and the MC's role, without the particular concentration on their own material that Carlin brought to every stage he stood on. Carlin was not a host in that sense. He was a performer, a specific kind of performer, one who had built something too individual to subordinate to the requirements of a format that was not his own. The hosts who returned to Saturday Night Live in the years that followed, who hosted multiple times, who became identified with the show over decades, were, almost without exception, performers who could bring their comedic personality to the material without insisting on the material being theirs. Carlin could not do this. Not because he lacked the skill, but because the thing he had built required the conditions he had built it for. Michaels understood this. Carlin understood it. And the understanding, once arrived at, was not complicated or resentful. It was simply the recognition that two things can be genuinely aligned in sensibility and genuinely incompatible in practice at the same time. Carlin went back to the concert stage. He went back to the albums. He continued building what he had been building, the body of work that would eventually include the HBO specials, the full-length performances that became the recordings most associated with his name. He built it in the conditions that suited it, for the audience that had come for it. And Saturday Night Live went on to become what it became, one of the longest-running programs in American television history, the show that introduced more comedic voices to national audiences than perhaps any other single program. It became this without Carlin, in the specific sense that he never hosted again. But it had been launched by him, and what he had given it on October 11th, 1975, the specific quality of his presence on that stage, on that night, the credibility he carried, the signal it sent to the audience that had followed his work that this show was something worth watching, was something that could not have been given by anyone else. The first host was the right host for the first night. What he was not was the right host for every night that followed. This is not a small thing. The first night is the night that determines whether there will be other nights. And Carlin had given that first night everything he had. He walked out of 30 Rockefeller Plaza in the early hours of October 12, 1975, and went back to the work he had come from. Behind him, in a television studio that would be inhabited by comedic voices for the next 50 years, Saturday Night Live was already becoming what it had decided to be. Two things had happened simultaneously in that studio on that night. A show had begun, and a comedian had confirmed for himself, as much as for anyone watching, that what he was building belonged to a different room. Both of those things were true at once. Both of them still are.